And welcome. So this is another town hall as we continue these ideas and forums for sharing ideas amidst the pandemic. We appreciate you being with us today. Uh, we have an exciting spotlight presentation. Before we get to that, I'd like to introduce the organization, starting with myself, which I often forget to introduce. My name is Tim Hines. I'm the Executive Director of the University Economic Development Association. And if you have any questions about the association or our presentation today, please feel free to reach out to me. My information is on the website, and I'd be happy to introduce you to our organization in more detail. Just to provide you a brief introduction, UEDA connects our members, which consist of higher education institutions, private sector businesses, and economic development organizations to resources that help facilitate economic growth within their communities. Our modern economy is all about innovation and entrepreneurship. It's about fostering talent. It's about developing a sense of place, and that's really where our members find the benefit of UEDA is sharing best practices in the areas of talent, innovation, and place. We're all gathered, and we gather on a regular basis to talk about how we can better each other's regions, how we can learn from each other, how we can adapt and grow. And it's within that spirit that we hold these town halls. It's within that spirit that we hold our conference each year. And we hope you join us in trying to better everyone's regions collectively and work for the prosperity of economic development within those regions. Our agenda is the same as every week. So we're going to start off with a spotlight presentation, and I'll introduce our speakers in a moment here and have some Q&A for them. You guys have more than 15 minutes if you want to take it to describe what you're doing in Oregon. And then we'll have an open forum. So that open forum is really where all of you who are participating have an opportunity to share your ideas of what you have going on in your regions, what you're leading, what others are doing. We want to hear about what's going on there. It's also an opportunity for you to ask questions of colleagues. So we have economic development colleagues from all across the globe on this call here today. And we want to gather and get an understanding of and help each other out, in that spirit. So if you do have any questions that you'd like to pose to the audience, please feel free to send those directly to me in the chat. If you have any questions for our speakers, please add that in the Q&A. And then later on, if you are in our open forum and you do have anything that you'd like to say, we're going to use the raise your hand feature, and I can bring you in and invite you in to speak. You can ask your question or give your answer in that way. So those are the three functions that we're going to be using in Zoom. I think we're all pretty familiar with those at this point. And we're going to kick things off with our presenters today. So the focus of the Institute for Policy and Research and Engagement at the University of Oregon has really been on providing data and visualizations to assist policymakers and the public. That's last week's. Sorry, that wasn't deleted from the script. I apologize. So scratch that. We're getting into Oregon this week. As the days meld together, so do the presentations. So I apologize, guys. But I'll introduce Bob Parker first. Bob is the co-director of the Institute of Policy and Research and Engagement and the program director of the Community Planning Workshop at the University of Oregon. Same initials, but different institution. Over the last 20 years, Bob has managed more than 300 policy and planning analysis projects with communities and state officials throughout Oregon. CPW is known widely throughout Oregon as one of the state's critical policy analysis resources, connecting expertise of university faculty and students with communities and agencies. These relationships, as well as the vast policy analysis experience, help CPW provide service to communities and organizations throughout Oregon. We also have with us Josh Bruce. Josh is the program director of the CSC's Oregon Partnership for Disaster Resilience. He's responsible for program management and oversight of OPDR's grants and projects, of their staff and student assistants. Josh's research interests include the identification, development, and use of integrated multi-objective approaches to achieve community resilience. And he currently serves as a board member for the Cascadia Region Earthquake Work Group. So I'll turn it over to both Robert and Josh, and I think Robert's going to be kicking it off and taking over controls. So take it away.
Great, thanks, Tim. So as Tim said, I'm Bob Parker, the Executive Director of the Institute for Policy Research and Engagement at the University of Oregon. Greetings from the West Coast. Good morning to all of you on the West Coast, and good afternoon to everybody else. We're going to present today on a white paper that we published back in early April called Responding to the Economic Impacts of Coronavirus, a proposed economic recovery and resilience framework. And so the genesis of this paper came out of the initial governor's order for shelter in place in Oregon. And what she did at that point was to task regional solutions coordinators. So in Oregon, we have a state agency called Regional Solutions that provides assistance across the broad spectrum of state services to regions with standing up economic recovery teams from the coronavirus pandemic. And so as we saw that, there was a lot of efforts that were focused on response, which was appropriate and continues to be appropriate, getting money out, supporting businesses and doing what we can to keep the economy going. But we were really interested in providing some context for what happens after the emergency operations centers close down, what happens after the federal money dries up, and how we as a group of practitioners in economic development can lead the way to economic recovery after this. So the devastation is going to be significant. The impacts are going to be long-term. How do we mobilize to lead recovery? How do we work together in ways that are effective? And where do we start? So we started this with an aspiration, which is to imagine that Oregon's economic development community embraces a consistent and holistic strategy to coordinate implementation of economic recovery efforts across lines: public, private, local, state, urban, and rural. What benefits does that bring, and what organizational framework is needed to support that? In our view, this is going to require an unprecedented level of cooperation between economic developers, but also between emergency managers and public health officials. So initially, we put together a taxonomy of how we think this is going to work, starting with the shutdown, which we think, the point we wrote this back in April, was going to go from March through June. The reopening, which is beginning to happen in some states now. Our state, Oregon, has collaborated with Washington and California to put together a framework for reopening, a phased framework. We're in the early phases of that. It's happening at a county level. It's incredibly complicated. And there's a lot of work to be done to get to that point. The third phase is recovery, and that's the phase that happens after we get through the reopening, after vaccination is available, when we can really start to look at rebuilding the economy in earnest. So we've been working in the space of economic development and emergency management, disaster resilience for decades in the Institute. And one of the things we've been thinking about, and this is really Josh's areas around resilience and recovery trajectories. We've done some projects with EDA around resilience training modules and getting regions prepared to do economic resilience. And the way we think about this is we have an initial condition of the community. Event occurs, there's a disaster threshold, shock. In this instance, the shock it's both a public health crisis as well as an economic crisis due to tasks that have been structured around the public health crisis. And then we get into a recovery period, which basically is going to take some time. We're talking about levels of resilience. How resilient are we, and how fast will we recover? So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Josh, and he's going to talk through basically the framework that we proposed for recovery and how we suggest that local economic development organizations, regional economic development organizations, partner with emergency managers, state officials, and federal government to begin to look at strategies for rebuilding the economy. Josh?
Great, thanks, Bob. Actually, maybe hold on that other slide there for just a
Yeah.
second. One of the things that I really want to emphasize is that the importance of the initial condition of the community. And one of the reasons we're really encouraging communities and organizations to think about recovery now is that part of the opportunity that COVID presents is thinking about the next crisis, right? COVID isn't going to be the last thing. In our region, we have chronic hazards that range from a flood and winter storm events to wildfires in the summer. We're also preparing for a big catastrophic event, a big catastrophic earthquake event. And so part of the opportunity we really want to drive home is that how can we set up our communities? How can we actually use COVID to bounce forward so that down the road, the initial condition of our communities, whether it's from an economic, social, environmental, kind of whatever your frame is, are better suited to absorb future crises. Okay, Bob, thanks. Next slide. So we really are thinking about this in a set of disaster leadership waves. We've certainly been in the first wave, the response wave, trying to figure out the public health side of this, trying to stabilize, get the testing and tracing going. And what I'll talk about here in a minute is that in parallel with the response and emergency operations activities that are going on, the sooner that we can start thinking about the continuity wave, or what might be, considered the initial or medium-term recovery phases, and thinking about the long-term recovery, the better. So, for example, the Economic Development Administration and International Economic Development Council all recommend that within 2 weeks of a crisis, economic development districts and economic development organizations be standing up business recovery centers, for example. And the reason for that is because businesses are going to go through phases of turning the lights off and then needing to scale back up, and having resources and structures in place early on in that process to work in tandem with the folks that are doing the emergency operations stuff is incredibly important. Next slide. We've presented in the white paper essentially a set of recommendations for an organizational structure for recovery. And I can speak mostly to Oregon because that's the part of the country I'm most familiar. But what I can tell you here is that we have not practiced or exercised or really developed muscle around recovery to big crises. Even though we have chronic events and things, they tend to be smaller scale. And so we haven't practiced coordinated structures, right, that work together for these outcomes. And so you see from the slide here, thinking about establishing separate but linked organizational structure that can work together and really link, leverage, and align the capabilities of response. For example, in terms of getting your immediate supply chains back up and running with long-term visioning around if this is going to potentially reorient local economies, how do we use those as an opportunity to think in the future about how we might be doing things different? Same thing with centralized leadership. What we're observing in our part of the world is, a lot of individual organizations doing really, really good work. But the leadership or the goals or the objectives do not tend to be connected maybe as much as we'd like to see. We were also certainly encouraging the state to be thinking about activating the state recovery plan and establishing the state disaster recovery coordinator early. We think that's a solid recommendation. We're happy to see that the state has essentially activated both the plan and have put an interim coordinator in that position. So that's good news. And then the rest of this is really around how can we convene regional economic continuity, understanding that our individual jurisdictions or organizations will not be able to weather this crisis on their own, and that they really need to have a clear playbook of actions for how they're going to work together, and coordinate and leverage each other's strengths instead of compete against each other. Next slide. This is a framework we put together about a decade ago, working with some rural counties in Oregon to think about disaster recovery frameworks. And I know this is a complicated slide, you probably can't see all of it. The key takeaways here, and for anybody familiar with emergency management, is that most of our jurisdictions have stood up an emergency operations center and have identified an incident commander to deal again with the immediate term public health, safety issues, et cetera. Hopefully some of that activity is informed by a local policy group. And really the important takeaway from this slide is that we're recommending establishing a parallel structure for recovery. That could be called essentially a recovery operations center, if it's really focused on economics and business, a business recovery center, but that some structure needs to be in place for that and have some leadership that can coordinate with the incident command and the emergency operations that are taking place. The incident command structure does provide a really good framework. It may not fit perfectly in a recovery stance, but in terms of the structure, you know, you want a planning section and a logistics section and a communications section. And so ICS presents some opportunities if you don't have an established recovery structure in place to build one. Next slide. In the white paper, we really tried to boil all that complicated stuff down into a much more simplified structure. You see it here. The key really being, again, the need for incident command leadership and objective setting at the top that's coordinated with integrated response, continuity, and recovery activities happening. We think just given capacities at the local level and at the regional level, this parallel structure makes the most sense. And then you can see a little bit about the types of things that those folks might do in the bottom. Next slide. The last thing I think I'll talk about before I hand it back over to Bob is just, this is sort of how Oregon structures connections between emergency support functions, which are really handled out of the Emergency Operations Center, and the recovery structure that the state of Oregon has in place. And so really, again, don't expect you to read all the detail of the graphic. The takeaway here is that there are clear opportunities to link what's happening in the Emergency Operations Center with activities that will need to stand up for both continuity and recovery phases. So economic recovery in Oregon, that's our state recovery function 2. That is going to tie down to business and industry, what's happening in our agriculture sectors, how is that connected back to transportation and critical infrastructure and things like that. SRF 3, which is health services, again, that's going to be connecting back to the public health operations that's happening in the Emergency Operations Center. So the bottom line, though, is that recovery needs to be considered, we think, by jurisdictions as a core function, that there has to be both horizontal and vertical integration of those activities and clear collaboration between state, regional, and local actors. Next slide. And Bob, I think this is where I hand it back off to you, yeah?
Yeah.
Great.
So a big part of what we were trying to do with the white paper is to get economic development professionals connected with the emergency management structure. And it's probably the case in every state that you've got a state EOC that is operational right now. Most counties will have an EOC that is also operational. In Lane County, where we live, they've stood up the EOC, and they've got people who are working on recovery. Apologies for that. In Eugene, the community that University of Oregon is in, we also have an EOC that's operational. Josh and I have been in contact with the city staff that are leading that process. And so the coordination ends up being critical in this, and how do you link those activities together, both vertically between the various entities that are going on, but also horizontally across all the functions that economic development needs to provide to support reopening. So in the white paper, we didn't propose a playbook necessarily, because we think those need to be crafted and customized for each region. What we really wanted to do is to talk about what kind of framework would help support this, and to remind people that ideas like the incident command structure are proven, they're effective. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to go through the training to understand how to use them. But they do provide a framework that you can use. So we started by asking a set of questions that are really difficult questions. How do we identify and prioritize action at this point? And this is underway right now in every community in the United States. But given an assessment of what your industry and economic development challenges are, what recovery outcomes should we be striving for? And this is something we've been pushing on a lot with our partners in terms of objective-based management. In ICS, there's this concept of having an incident action plan, and without a set of objectives to work to, I think it makes it considerably more difficult to align activity. The second one is what activities will have the biggest impact. Where do we make investments that will have impact? And that's challenging. We've got a lot of businesses that are feeling a lot of pain. If the research that's been done on business impacts after disasters in the past is true, we'll be looking at many business closures. Businesses are not going to reopen. There's going to be, in my view, wholesale reorganization of sectors of the economy. And so the question is, how do we lead our way through that and support an effective recovery? And as Josh said, a recovery that leads to a more resilient economy moving forward. So prioritization ends up being important. Then how can local governments deploy federal, state, and local investments in a coordinated effort to achieve agreed upon recovery outcomes and meaningful impacts? So the first thing, again, is having identified those outcomes. Without the outcome, it's really difficult to determine where you should make those investments. And then the final is, how do we mobilize networks for action, right? Economic development's always been a team sport. No individual entity is able to do all the functions. What we see in Oregon is, I think, likely similar to what exists across the United States, which is you've got a lot of various organizations that provide specific functions that are loosely connected through networks where nobody can tell anybody else what to do. So how do you get those organizations to align in ways that will help lead us through recovery? In a place like Oregon, that's, I think, compounded by the nature of our state, where we've got metro areas, we've got a economic corridor along Interstate 5, we've got coastal areas that have another set of challenges and are very tourism based, and then we've got 10 counties in Oregon that USDA considers frontier counties that have population densities of less than 6 persons per square mile, that have had fragile economies for decades now. So where to start? Well, the obvious place is to continue response efforts, get the federal money out, to begin to mobilize for continuity and recovery action. So as Josh said, our framework really says work with your incident command structure and the response team, but think about how to set up a separate but linked recovery center to begin to do the planning and thinking that it's going to need to move things forward. Map assets, and assets they're not just focused on what you've got in your local economy. It's who do you have in your network and what can you do with the resources that you have. We, at least in Eugene, have come to the conclusion that we're going to lead ourselves through this. The university is partnering with the local health officials to begin to stand up the contact tracing and testing capacity that's going to be needed to really safely reopen our economy here. And so we're not waiting for the federal government or others to come from outside. And there's obviously going to be a local and state government fiscal crisis on the other side of this that I think is going to compound the problems. Analyze areas of risk. So we've been doing a lot of thinking about vulnerabilities within industries. How do those link? If you're not familiar with the National Business Emergency Operations Center that FEMA runs, I encourage you to look at that. There's a lot of useful information that they're pumping out that's at the national level that's helped us understand how the broader economic impacts may come to bear here in Oregon. Apply principles of agile strategy. So we think that traditional strategic planning, your comprehensive economic development strategy is not going to be particularly effective in this environment. It's evolving so rapidly that we need to have approaches where we go through think, do cycles in much rapider cycles than we typically would do with a SEDS, and consider resilience within those kinds of investments, and then finally get started. So what are we doing with respect to reopening? I just want to share a little bit what's happening here. So this is a University Economic Development Association. I imagine most of the people that are on this webinar are associated with universities in some way or another. And I imagine you're struggling with the exact same things that we are, which are, how do you move to remote teaching? What are we going to do in fall? Are we going to be able to reopen? What's that going to mean for enrollment, for budgets, and so on? And University of Oregon stood up their incident management team back in at the end of February, and really started monitoring coronavirus in detail, and quickly pivoted us. We're on a quarter system, so we had the advantage of having a couple of weeks after the governor shut the state down and basically said we're not going to have in-person classes to pivot and do online teaching. We've gone to remote teaching for the summer, but the university is really putting a push to reopen campus in fall. So the first thing that we're looking at, and Josh and I are participating in the IMT as part of the external recovery team, is we have a shared fate of the fate of the university is linked to the fate of Lane County and cities of Eugene and Springfield, and the extent to which we can reopen will be linked to the capacity of the institution as well as our local governments to do the things that are necessary. A big question that we've been working on is how do we stand up countywide testing, tracing programs, protocols? How do we pay for them? We're about to release a white paper that speaks to the cost of doing that, and the main thrust of it is that the cost of doing it is expensive, but it's a whole lot cheaper than continuing to have entire segments of the economy shut down. And then how do we engage industry partners in this? So about a month ago, the university bought a testing machine. They're partnering with a local hospital to stand up testing capacity, partnering with our county health department and our county administrator to leverage their capacity. And one of our questions has been, well, how do we get the economic development groups involved in this? How do we link to businesses? At least our community has businesses that work in the biosciences area that can contribute to the overall effort. So those are things that we are working on. And then I'm going to leave with this, which is we have run a EDA University Center out of the Institute for 11 years now. And we've been thinking about how to leverage our university center out of this. So the first thing is that we're engaged with our incident management team on engagement activities related to reopening recovery. So one of the things that the university wanted to do as we moved to remote teaching was to continue to create community within the University of Oregon so that that we still feel like we're all ducks in this instance. And so they've set up a branch of the IMT that is working on engagement activities. And then external community and economic recovery support, local and statewide. So we're looking at embedding people from our AmeriCorps program into economic development districts in the state. We'll likely be closely partnering with our local county and city officials in recovery, and hopefully convening groups to begin to talk about how we work together to move forward. To bring together, Tim talked about community planning workshop, which is a required course for our graduate students in the community regional planning program. And for decades, we've been engaging them in sponsored research projects, applied research projects, planning projects for communities throughout the state. And we've got one team that's working in our region on economic resilience right now. And that's been, I think, a significant learning opportunity for them because it's pivoted into really thinking about recovery from coronavirus. What kind of faculty support is useful? And then finally, we're engaging with the National COVID-19 Research Consortium that the Washington office of EDA has stood up. So I'm going to stop there, and we can respond to questions, or maybe Tim's got something for us.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I appreciate it. Yeah, just a reminder: if you do have questions, please type those in the Q&A panel, and we'll be sure to get those to Josh and Bob. But first, it looks like you've had a significant amount of work that's been done prior to this with catastrophic earthquake events or whatever. How significant or how much impact does that type of event have on the structure that you've created relative to response and planning?
I'm going to let Josh respond to that one as our director of the Oregon Partnership for Disaster Resilience.
It's a really good question. I think, I've been working on this stuff for 10 or 12 years in the state. And despite having some pretty significant risks out there, in our region, we essentially get what Japan got in 2011, a big megathrust subduction zone earthquake followed by a big tsunami. And even that, despite quite a bit of training and engagement and planning work, I'm a little bit disappointed to say I'm not seeing a bunch of that translate to the pre-work that's needed to get the structures in place to respond to a COVID type event, right? I think at the end of the day, I think what we really try and help jurisdictions and organizations think about are scalable and flexible frameworks, right? We learned in recovery planning work that we did 10 years ago. My colleague Mike Howard's on the panel today. Work with me on that. We found that a plan for an event that you really don't know exactly what you're going to get is not particularly useful, and it's not nimble in that if we don't get the earthquake and we get COVID instead, right? The issues are going to be quite different. And so what we really encourage people to do is think about a flexible, scalable structure that can really fit the needs of the crisis that's coming at you, whether it be local, whether it be regional, whether it be national or global, and to try and build in principles of resilience like diversity and redundancy, or interconnected networks, or broadening participation from those industry partners, public sector partners that Bob was talking about, so that you have a fighting chance to come together and say, okay, let's set some objectives and collectively figure out how we're going to get there.
No, that's good. And what about on a regular basis, considering, agility in your plans with basic normal plans like SEDS plans in your region, how, in what ways can that be lessons learned in developing just the regular, economic development planning?
I know from my perspective, I mean, I worked on the community economic development strategy for our region 5 years ago. We've got a student team that's working on helping set the stage for the update to that plan. Our region had been through probably 3 or 4 cycles, right? So every 5 years over a 20-year period of updating the plan. And when we came in, we got a lot of feedback that people were kind of over it. Like they didn't feel like they were getting value out of the planning process. And so what we attempted to do was focus less on specific planning stuff like goals and objectives, although those are in there. But we really tried to work with the district to establish a structure for how to actually get stuff done. And I think from our perspective, that's the core of agile strategy, is moving from plan every 5 years and then hope somebody remembers and actually does something before you get to the update, to a much more think-do cycle that's on a much more rapid pace. So I think as districts are thinking about updating their economic development strategies in a COVID environment, getting away from setting 5, 10, 20-year goals because there's so much uncertainty out there, and really focusing on how do we link, leverage, and align the assets that are in front of us now to reach these short, medium, and long-term. I'm saying long-term in the sense of like a year or 18 months, right? That we're going to need to be understanding how COVID's going to play out, right? We could very well see communities opening up and then having to retract again. And so being prepared for those eventualities is important.
Yeah, there's always been inherent limitations in strategic planning, and I have a fair degree of frustration with those, having done them for decades now, and having done what I think is a lot of good work, and then having it fall flat on the implementation side. So it really ends up being, how do you execute your plan? And these frameworks end up being really important. We have been partnering with, there's a bunch of frameworks that are emerging around how to manage complex collaborations, which effectively is what economic development is. And so again, we're talking about vertical integration from local to regional and state economic development activities, and then horizontal across the various functions, whether it's entrepreneurship and innovation, or capital, access to capital, or workforce, et cetera, infrastructure.
Critical infrastructure.
Yeah. And so we've been using the collective action framework or impact framework that's come out of Stanford as one approach to think about. One we've used pretty extensively is called strategic doing, came out of Purdue. And it turns strategic planning on its head and says, strategic planning tends to be an open-ended effort, right? You come up with a vision and you come up with goals, and let's say you got 5 goals, which is not atypical for an economic development strategy, and then you've got 3 strategies for each of those, and 5 actions under them, and all of a sudden you got hundreds of actions, and there's a lack of clarity on what the priorities are moving forward. And so strategic doing turns out and says, well, what are things we can do now with the assets that we have at our disposal to begin to move these issues forward? And it's quite scalable. We've used it on topics from homelessness to economic development to basic police and social services. So that's a framework that's worth exploring on the agile strategy. And I'll throw a link into the strategic doing website and the feed here. It's also around partnerships. So one of the things we did 3 years ago with the UC was a statewide economic development needs assessment. And part of what we were interested in was not only what do local and regional economic development professionals need, as well as communities, but what's happening in the space of collaboration, what's working, what's not working. And there really is broad consensus, at least among economic development and city managers in Oregon, that economic development's a team sport. It's not news to anybody. But the way it's being executed is really quite uneven across the state. There's some really shining examples of things that I think are working very well, like the sector strategy approach that we're using here in Lane County, and some other places where I think that there's lots of ample room for improvement, I would say.
Yeah. I just add 2 things, and just specifically to answer Margot's comment in the chat. I think I would encourage people, if they haven't gone to restoreyoureconomy.org, which is the EDA IDEC sort of framework structure for how to think about recovery and resilience in the context of an economic development strategy. That could be a really good place to start to get some ideas for what to put in the SEDS that EDA might respond to. And then the last thing is just, I just feel like a lot of this is organization culture development. We've done some work with an outfit out of New Zealand called Resilient Organizations NZ. And they have a kind of a three-part structure for how to think about developing resilience in an organization that could be also very beneficial and useful.
Great. Yeah, and I want to come back to the point on long-term planning, because I know that as part of our open forum, we do have a question that's specifically related to that, and I hope that you guys will both weigh in on that. How much, whenever you were showing your structure, it definitely included statewide and local and then federal. So similar to the comment about what impact does that event have on your structure, what does the federal response and their organization levels, and this isn't meant to be a political question, but what impact does that have on trickle down to your planning efforts and what you've created as far as organization.
Yeah, I do really want to be clear. I would say that we've used information from a lot of different sources. So we're presenting as I wouldn't want to take credit for like ICS or the structural stuff. We're packaging information that's out there. It's a really good question, and I think here's how my head works on this question is to invert the responsibility pyramid and really start local. There's a phrase in emergency management that all disasters are local, right? Because even with COVID, this is a global thing, but the impacts we're feeling at individual household, individual business, individual community scale. And so I think because that is how we experience them, it's really important to start at the local level and say, let's say the state can't show up or the feds can't show up. How could we do at least our best job of responding at the local level? And then as those other layers are coming in, that becomes maybe more icing or gravy rather than we're waiting around for somebody else to show up. And I think increasingly, given the uncertainty not only around COVID, but other issues like climate change, and the future is increasingly fuzzy, right? And we don't know the types of things that we're going to get. And so having structures that are locally derived and where investments are being made in developing and maintaining those, I think is really fundamental. It's not to say that we don't also, I think, need good vertical alignment. And in an event like this, I can say I wish we were seeing a different type of leadership or a different style of leadership, not only at the federal level, but even at the state, the district, the individual county levels. And so, yeah, that's what I'd say. I would say always start with your own jurisdiction and figure out if the cavalry never showed up, how would we try and orient ourselves to deal with the problem at hand?
Yeah, I'm guessing it's the case that every person on this call has had some level of frustration at all levels of government in the past. Government can tend to be inflexible, bureaucratic, and so on. I think that part of what we have spent a lot of time thinking about and working on is how you build networks that are scalable, resilient, flexible. And within the resilient organizations framework that Josh mentioned, they really talk about 3 indicators related to resilience: leadership and culture. And one of the ongoing frustrations that I've had, and I think Josh shares, is it would be useful to have a different type of leadership. That's easy to say and much harder to do when you're in the leadership position. That institutions, organizations, and communities should be change ready, right? So thinking about what's our proactive posture? How do we stress test our plans? What are our strategies? Do we have unity of purpose? Simple things like that. Then networks and relationships. How do you leverage your networks and relationships? And again, Tim, I would say that there's both the vertical part of it right across levels of government, and we have some additional levels in Oregon with councils of governments and special districts and so on. But also across organizations, right? So, how do you link? One of the things I think universities think a lot about is what's our role in the economic development ecosystem? How do we have impact? And at the University of Oregon, it's historically been less about we're a tier 1 AAU institution that's pumping out research that's being commercialized, although that's changing significantly with the Knight campus that's coming online. And it's been more about how do we engage in the broader economic development ecosystem within our state? How do we engage with Oregon Economic Development Association? How do we engage with local partners, with nonprofits that are doing economic development activities? And so that at some level, that there's more resources out there than we sometimes feel like we have. And I think it's a matter of leveraging and aligning those resources. And that takes work. You've got to build relationships for those things to be effective. And the way you build relationships is, as the folks who develop strategic doing mention, is that you do things together, and that builds trust within your network, and then that trust begins to attract additional actors, and eventually you come up with a healthy collaboration. So and that's something that's maybe difficult or ill-advised to build in the middle of a pandemic, but part of what we've seen is that it's actually happening in Oregon in ways that I have not observed. What's happening at the region with some of our regional solution recovery teams is really an unprecedented level of cooperation. So our question is, how can that be sustained? And then for us as an organization, how do we support that moving forward? And I think it's easier to do within a crisis. But there's always a tail end. Every disaster opens a window, and that window stays open for a short period of time, and then things kind of go back to whatever equilibrium they are. In this instance, I don't think the normal coming out the other end of this is going to look like the normal that we had a couple of months ago. There's going to be a realignment of a number of things, and I think it presents some opportunities to think about our systems and how we can do things differently, particularly along community and economic resilience.
Yeah, I think that that's something, you know, as we approach into our summit, our conference in September, it's one thing that we're definitely going to be looking at is, you know, how can we ensure that we're creating structures for economic resilience moving forward, whether it's partnerships, whether it's, you know, other pieces of that ecosystem that are necessary, that let's not rely on, you know, major disasters to come together. I want to take one more question, and then I want to go to our open forum, because I do have a question that I want to come back to that I had mentioned. But is there a shared definition of success for recovery from your stakeholders? And, you know, within your ecosystem, who's tasked at mentoring that success?
Yeah, and so I'm going to start on this one since Josh started on the other ones. And I would say at this point, I don't think so. So it comes back to the points we made about objective-based management. And you know, at some level, emergency management is just like rapid cycles of strategic planning. You set an objective, you go do it, and then you figure out what you learn and what you're going to do next. Sort of the same idea that strategic doing has with the 30-30 meetings. We're going to spend 30 minutes every 30 days assessing what happened, what we learned, and recrafting our path forward. So that's been a frustration. I'll just be direct with everybody on this. We've been having that conversation here among our team, among the incident management team, which is a number of us in the Institute, as well as our government relations liaison and an economist that runs the Oregon Economic Forum. There are no objectives at this point, or if there are, they're not being widely broadcast, and they're certainly not shared across organizations, right? So when we talk to our various local government partners, they're telling us different things. I would contrast that with what the university is doing and what Andre Leduc, our Chief Resilience Officer, is doing, which is the objectives of what the university are doing are crystal clear, and they've mobilized. There's 150 people in the IMT that are working on reopening and all of the activities that need to occur around that. This is an interesting question, and Josh probably has an opinion on this, which is, you know, or should those objectives come from the bottom up, or should they come from the top down? And I think what we're likely to do in the coming weeks is to propose a set of community and economic recovery. So objectives for Lane County and our municipal governments to put something out there to have conversations about a place to start, because we don't see it happening right now in our region. And we think it's absolutely necessary that people start getting on the same page about what outcomes we're trying to achieve, right? How do we craft pathways to get there if we don't know where we're going? I imagine that there will be a set of fairly specific outcomes that or objectives that come out of the state recovery effort and through the recovery coordinator, which would be useful, because that then becomes a guiding star that we can point to and say, this is what we're trying to achieve, with some specific, hopefully, deadlines or timeframes that we're trying to achieve those things within.
I would just say really quickly, I think with respect to mentoring, I think that was kind of at the core of writing the white paper, right? Which is an acknowledgement that the emergency operations structure is very focused on pretty quick, rapid cycle addressing the problem at hand, but it, from my perspective, tends to be slightly more reactive, right? That's the way the structure is set up. We have a need out in the community; it's a public health need or something. How do we go and address that? Getting PPE to the hospital, or getting testing set up, or whatever it is. Recovery there's a huge opportunity to be much more proactive, and that's where we don't necessarily see somebody holding the candle or the mantle saying, we understand the short term, let's keep people healthy, keep people safe, try and get the economy going again if we can, right? Long term, what are our long-term goals? What are our long-term objectives? Somebody else needs to hold that candle and say, we're going to try and mobilize the people that aren't directly involved with keeping the hospitals open, keeping people safe. And we're going to say, how are we going to orient our community for a better future? And if we can, use COVID to bounce forward.
Great. And I did post a link in the chat to your white paper as well as your COVID-19 Resource Center. So if anyone wants to take a look at that and dig in, I know that your contact information is throughout there, so they can definitely reach back out to you. I did want to open it up to the open forum at this point. We did get a question in that I'd like to tackle here and let you both respond to it first. And if anyone in the audience would like to respond, use the raise your hand feature and I can call on you and bring you in to give your response to this question. We get a question that asks, what models and methods exist for planning for the 3 different economic and resiliency scenarios? Those are listed as the polio scenario, where a vaccine's developed within 2 to 3 years and COVID can be almost completely eradicated. The next corona variant scenario, where another version rocks the globe within the next decade, or the reoccurrent flu variant scenario, where we take shots and just get used to the deaths. Is there any type of long-term planning and consideration that, again, we'll start with Oregon, is doing right now, but I want to open it up to everyone else to respond if anything, any type of long-term planning scenarios for those long-term planning efforts for those scenarios are being discussed within your region. So Bob and Josh, go to you first.
Well, we're certainly discussing those internally, and there's a lot of unknowns at this point, clearly. Consistent with the theme of this entire presentation, we would encourage people to be thinking, how do we build resilience within this? And a good place to start is to think about how do we make strategic investments in the infrastructure that can help us become more resilient moving forward. And so in this instance, that's public health infrastructure, clearly. And we've had a ongoing problem in rural areas, both in Oregon, I think nationally, where some of the statistics had suggested that up to 25% of the rural hospitals were at risk of closing. On one of the early calls we had when the governor started floating the framework for reopening, what we were hearing from some of the rural mayors is, we have zero capacity to do testing, contact tracing on this. So how do we build that capacity in there? From a broader resilience perspective, and I think, thinking about things like the diversity of our economy, redundancy of systems, for us, we're in some respects, we feel like this is significantly easier than Cascadia 9.0 scenario that we would have, where we wouldn't even be having, we would have the capacity to have this webinar right now, because basically all of the infrastructure that supports the Northwest is taken out for a period of, up to a couple of years. If you read the New Yorker article, came out a couple of years ago. Josh probably has more coherent thoughts on that particular question than I do.
I think that's right. I think regardless, it's good to think about what the scenarios would be. And I would actually be, what I've been encouraging our partners to do is actually even expand that list, right? I mean, there's COVID, but it doesn't mean the earthquakes or the wildfires have gone away. I was watching the news this morning. It looks like Florida is already on fire. So we have other issues to deal with, and so I think it's right to scenario plan and understand what the range of potential crises or vulnerabilities are. And to Bob's point, then really think about how do we have a more resilient mindset. I was on a call last Friday. There is a hospital in one of our coastal counties that's inside the tsunami inundation zone. It's an older hospital. Probably the community would really like to relocate it, but that's a big monetary lift. But still, the solution set is to build a new hospital. One of the questions I asked was, well, we're going to have islands on the Oregon coast anywhere. People aren't going to be able to get to that hospital, even if you do a brand new shiny one. What about, instead of spending that $100 million on a hospital, we're spending $10 million a piece on regional clinics, right, that are dispersed more throughout the community? How would that help in a COVID setting? How would that help in a big earthquake, tsunami setting? And so just really trying to get outside our bubbles, outside our boxes, and think creatively and more nimbly about the solution sets, I think, is important. And one way to deal with the uncertainty of, we don't know if we're going to get a vaccine, or if COVID's here to stay, or it's going to be the next virus to come out.
Tim, I think part of it is reorienting our thinking about investments, right? So, and particularly government investments, but I believe also in the private sector, who may not have as deep appreciation, at least as I've developed through decades of working with our team on disaster, about the importance of just basic infrastructure and the degree to which we take for granted that the roads are going to work, that the water is going to be delivered, that we're going to have broadband access and all those things. As we're learning now, the cost of having the public health infrastructure is significantly less than the cost of shutting down entire sectors of our economy. So how do we reorient our public investment strategies to begin to recognize that, and recognize that there is value in preparing for high impact, low frequency events, the black swans. And I'm not sure I would call coronavirus a black swan. It's not like we didn't know that the risk existed for this. But we certainly were, I don't think it's an understatement to say that we've been unprepared in some really fundamental ways at sort of all levels of working through this. So we're certainly learning a lot right now, and I think those lessons are lessons we can apply, as Josh says, bounce forward in productive ways to become more resilient.
Absolutely. Anyone from the audience, again, if you want a chance to speak, we've got a minute left. Happy to take any insight from the audience, or if you do have insight after the fact, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to share that on with the person that asked, as well as even next week. Seeing none, I think we'll close everything out. I appreciate you all being here, particularly Bob and Josh sharing what you've done in Oregon. It's been great to see how things are progressing in different parts of the world, and really appreciate what you're doing there to help planning. We will be back next week with another town hall. I think we're going to continue these weekly through May, and then likely switch to an every other week format starting in June. So please look forward to that. Again, if you have any questions that you would like to pose to the overall audience about things that you're doing within your region, please send those via email to me. My email address is tim.hindes@universityeda.org, and I'll be happy to share those with the group. Again, Oregon folks, Bob, Josh, thank you for being here, and everyone else in the meantime, stay safe.
Thank you, Tim, and thanks everybody
thanks for the invite, and thanks for everything you're doing, Tim.
All right, thanks guys.
Yeah.
Take care.